Hello, hello. Welcome back to this final session in the auditorium, although it will be followed by something of a scavenger hunt in the wider museum and some wrap-up activities back up in the Huth Gallery. This session, which is being streamed live to the main UR22 event in Florianopolis in Brazil, is called From a Ripple to a Surge, Understanding and Responding to Compound Risk. To run this session, I'm handing over to Dr. Simpiwe Laura Stewart, who holds a PhD in Human Geography from the University of Oxford. She's a technical advisor on climate and conflict at the Red Cross Climate Centre, with extensive experience in research and policy development, including work at the intersection of climate and conflict, economic justice, and social policy in sub-Saharan Africa. Previous projects and publications include, for US federal government, humanitarian and development agencies such as the IFRC, the UN FAO, the World Bank, and Concern Worldwide. Over to you, Sophia.
You can hear me? Wonderful. Okay. Hi, everyone who's in the room and everyone who's joining online. As mentioned, my name is Simpiwe Laura Stewart, and our session today is with three exceptional academics who collectively are going to talk us through something called compound and cascading risks. Just by a clap of your hands, who has heard about compound risks, compound or cascading risks? Okay, fantastic. So we are in really good company today. Very briefly, our session will go through some of the root causes of compound and cascading risks in the context of climate change. We'll think about superstructural or sort of bird's eye view solutions to compound and cascading risk, and then we will think about some of the finance-based solutions or potential solutions to compound and cascading risk. I don't want to take up too much of our time today. We're hoping that the session will be both informative, help you think in new ways, innovatively about compound and cascading risk, but also that you'll then join us for an interactive element, which Pablo, and I'm sure most of you will be happy to hear, will be walking us through shortly. So we're going to start off the program with reflections on the root causes of disaster risk. And I hand over now to Dr. Ksenia Chmutina, without further ado, to walk us through.
Super, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. All right, I'm going to start with a really simple question. How many of you know the story of Three Little Pigs? Yeah, most, right, fantastic, that's a great start. So just to recap for those of you who don't know, there were three little pigs. They knew that there is a big bad wolf out there. The first little pig went and built the straw house, the second pig used branches, and the third, of course, used bricks. And then the wolf came and blew the straw house down, then blew the branches house down, and then he puffed and huffed and huffed and puffed and couldn't destroy the brick house. And so the little pigs hid there. Not in all cultures, the pigs survived. So where I grew up, the first and second pig got actually eaten. So it's just the third little pig got survived, but never mind that. And there are so many stories like that. So from very early age, we learn that there is a hazard. There is a big bad wolf, right? We know that it is there. And the kind of stories also tell us that people, or pigs in our case, are put at risk because they end up being in the wrong time, at the wrong kind of place. And the proper response to this is to apply the necessary scientific expertise, which is kind of very often technological solution, to predict or prevent the threat and so to reduce the risk, i.e. to build the brick house. But have we, as disaster experts, ever stopped and asked ourselves, what do we actually know about these three little pigs? Do we understand their lived realities? Do we know, for example, that the first little pig was brought up by a disabled grandmother, and so they couldn't go to school because they had to look after her? Do we know that the second little pig was studying really, really hard, but they were brought up by a single mother, a sin in pig society? And they got amazing vocational skills, and in fact, it was them who built the brick house for the third little pig, but the third little pig didn't pay them enough. And do we know that the third little pig, in fact, invested, and inherited and invested quite a lot of gold? And they were looking for a way to evict the first and second little pig because they wanted to buy the land. And they wanted to then sell their land to their wealthy mates and make profit. So the gray big bad wolf was actually a blessing in disguise for them. So if we care to engage with the lived realities of these three little pigs, it becomes clear that it is not the big bad wolf that creates disaster. And moreover, we usually know that there is a big bad wolf out there, but we don't have resources to protect ourselves. Or in fact, we are prevented from protecting ourselves. Furthermore, we criticize the behavior of those people who have access to little resources, and we instead promote privilege as virtue. And this is exactly why understanding the root causes of disasters is critical if we are ever to reduce disaster risks. I hope all of us in this room accept now that disasters are not natural. The Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction explicitly recognizes inequality and poverty as drivers of vulnerability of disasters. And in fact, SDGs are a fantastic way of measuring disaster root causes. We know that gendered violence is connected to community experiences of disasters. We also know that income inequality is relevant to livelihood precarity and hazard risks. But herein lies the problem. When looking at Sendai framework indicators, it becomes apparent that the definition of disasters that many of us are using, that UN is using, that really promotes vulnerability and the root causes of disasters, does not match the approach to measuring the progress towards disaster risk, because development data is not utilized in these indicators. And instead, Sendai framework indicators, as well as many other indicators that we're using in disaster risk reduction, shift attention away from systemic injustice, inequality, exploitation, neglecting the economic, social, and political conditions that produce vulnerability in the first place. And instead, the indicators focus on measuring impact and loss, and sometimes the explicit implementation of DRR strategies at the national level. Health, gender, poverty, insecure land tenure, lack of access to education and other services, among many others, are all the manifestations of disaster root causes. And this could inform or even address how we reduce disaster risk. Yet there is no incorporation of development data by Sendai framework, despite its rhetoric. And so we are missing the opportunity to have a longer view on how risks are produced throughout the space and time. And if we continue to do so, we are playing a very dangerous technocratic game that can easily be thrown off by a new hazard or, in fact, compound risks. Because the international approach to reducing disaster risk remains largely focused on hazards rather than vulnerability. And the rhetoric has a lot to play in hiding the root causes of disasters. At the heart of disaster risk reduction now lies the idea of resilience that is supported by a small cousin, Building Back Better. This is my favorite slide of all times because it summarizes the disaster risk creation better than anything else. The emphasis of Building Back Better is on continuity, in other words, on continuing no matter what. The goal of Building Back Better is not to alleviate the original conditions that created the crisis, but instead to move past as quickly as we possibly can without altering the underlying conditions, which are political, economic, and social structures. Resilience emphasizes the core of neoliberalism as a mode of political rationality and government reasoning that constructs and regulates the realm within which a disaster occurs. The contradiction here is that disaster exposes inequalities, whereas neoliberal capitalism really relies on the maintenance of these same inequalities for its existence. Disasters don't bring suffering, they simply expose it. Those who are most marginalized are also those who are mostly affected by disasters. But at the same time, for the marginalized, disaster is not a new, sudden, or unexpected event. It is simply a continuation of everyday harm inflicted on them. Disasters are often portrayed as kind of unexpected external shocks and frequently naturalized or framed as inevitable. And therefore, the root causes cannot be altered, and therefore it's us who must adapt. And it is this rhetoric This framing of disasters and the focus of the international and national policies and decisions that focus on hazards rather than marginalization, injustice and inequality that keep contributing to recreation of disaster risks. This framing creates an illusion that seems real, the effect that is called hypernormalization, where it is the story and not the reality that matters. The story narrated through resilience is the story of successful recovery, of going back to normal, of capitalist aspiration, of living happily ever after. But we know that such ending is only possible in fairy tales and only for some little pigs. Disaster risk reduction in reality ends up being the process of recreation of disaster risks and sometimes enhancement of recreation of inequalities that eventually lead to yet another disaster. And compound risks that we're seeing more and more often are a perfect illustration of that. So what needs changing? The understanding of compound risks must be grounded in praxis between technical problem solving and commitment to humanity. Disaster risk reduction approaches will always be full of contradiction, tension, dilemmas, and struggles of power, but they can be more equitable if the reflective practice lies at the heart of them. Disaster risk reduction initiatives should not and cannot be adopted without engaging and really understanding the unequal and often oppressive social, political, and economic systems. Only then can we turn relevant information into actionable knowledge that would actually help us make critical choices about compound risks. Understanding the context is not about geographical setting or not just about having technical skills. Culture, politics, power, and also our role as experts in all of this, I would argue, are much more important. This can only be done through empathy, humility, and dialogue. We must recognize our collective ties, our interdependence. We must recognize that we're all dependent on each other. So there is hope. Achieving disaster risk reduction requires collaborative and decentralized effort that challenges the long-established systems and ideological structures of neoliberalism, neocolonialism, racism, patriarchy, and so on. When we speak about compound risks, when we make decisions about disaster risk reduction, we need to talk about the systemic root causes of disasters that are grounded in oppression and marginalization. What we say and do when it comes to disaster risk reduction should be about ethics, equity, power, and responsibility, and not about hazards or economic growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ksenia. Obviously a very fast sort of overview of compound risk, but essentially, and according to the IPCC, compound risk suggests or indicates that we need to move away from that paradigm of single hazard risk assessment and think more intersectionally, more dynamically about the various root causes, mediating influences, and risk or threat multipliers that come into play in the context of climate change, which include, as Ksenia has so dynamically mentioned, issues like displacement, like wealth and income inequality, and other systemic and societal issues. And that was, again, Ksenia Chmutina, who is a reader in sustainable and resilient urbanism at the School of Architecture, Building and Civil Engineering at Loughborough University. So we're going to bring it a little bit closer to home now with Dr. Kate Raworth, who's going to walk us through some of the big picture solutions to reduce compound and cascading risks. Some of you might know Kate from her work on donut economics. If you've not heard about donut economics, then I assume at the very least that you enjoy donuts, in which case your interest hopefully is piqued. And I'm going to hand right over to Dr. Kate Raworth, who joins us from the University of Oxford.
Hi, thanks very much. It's a big pleasure to join you. And I'm going to be sharing my screen to talk through some ideas about the only donuts that actually turn out to be good for us. The good news is that we don't need to eat these donuts because they are conceptual. So what I want to share with you today is a framework that brings some of the core ideas of donut economics together with this thinking about compounding risk in context of inequity, in context of power, to see whether we can create a really useful tool for this community to use. And I've been working on these ideas with Pablo Suarez, who's joining us today, and with the designer Ruud Priester. So let me jump in. Let's think about economic actors in contexts of risk and crisis. And let's always remember that the economy is embedded in human society, embedded in the living world. The economy, we can say, has four essential kinds of relations: the market and the state. People sometimes forget also the household and the commons. And these are mediated by flows of finance, which should be making sure that value flows between them and should be in service to them. Now, let's think about the actual relationships and the unique characteristic of the different kinds of relationships in these different forms of provisioning. There's the market, where the relation is mediated by price-based exchange. You've got a producer and a consumer, and this is the realm of market activity, often highly unequal, of course, as has already been said. And then there's the state, that space of public provisioning of health, of education, of essential public goods, the state provider and the recipient. There's also, of course, the household, where we all begin every day in the space of unpaid caring work. The relationship between the carer, often a parent or an adult, and the dependent, a child, an elder, or somebody with needs of dependency. And that is the space of unpaid care that makes life work. And then there's the commons, the place where people come together, not through the market or the state, but as a community and steward resources and assets that they collectively value and protect. And here we meet as commoners. And then in the space of finance, where finance should be a monetary flow to enable these other forms, we've got the relationship between the lender and the borrower, the debtor and the creditor, or the grantor and the grantee. Now, what happens to these relationships, which already are imbued with power imbalances, with inequalities? What happens in contexts of disruption? And I'm going to bring some examples today from climate-related disruptions. How do people and different sectors respond, and what kind of different ways might they respond? So in the market space, that exchange can very rapidly turn into exploitation of a more powerful actor through money, through privilege, through market reach. In the public space, the state, that state can either turn into an oppressor or the state failure, where the state utterly fails and is incapable of providing those essential public goods. The household can be disrupted, and that space of caring and safety turns into vulnerability for its members. And the commons can become captured and enclosed by vested interests, and therefore degraded and excluding the rest. Finance, of course, can become incredibly powerful, or it can become frozen in many contexts. The stopping of flows of finance because of uncertainties. So how can we put these ideas to work? What if we take this thinking about the changing roles and relations in these different forms of provisioning in context of compounding risk and shock? And I'm going to bring in here now that donut, the one that you don't have to eat, but that you can use to think. The goal of this donut is to ensure that we can meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. That means leave nobody in the hole in the middle, where people fall short on the essentials of life. But don't overshoot planetary boundaries. And we know from climate risks that overshooting planetary boundaries creates more shocks and more risks, which indeed do push people below the social foundation and into the hole in the donut. And I just want to share some examples that I think can illustrate maybe this can become a useful tool. I want to say again, this is something we've just started inventing, and I'm going to invite you to help us really make it a useful tool. So some examples. What happens when households are disrupted by drought? Much empirical evidence from rural Southern Africa has shown that when households face drought, of course, they face a loss of water use, food, and income, and subsistence households therefore are disrupted in providing that care. A parent or an adult may need to go to an urban market and earn a cash income as a wage laborer. Girls are very often taken out of school and become domestic servants or forced into transactional sex. And so we find really strong impacts on that household's health, on education, and on gender equity. Now, a question is there something that the state or other actors could have done to make sure that the household is not forced to protect itself, to respond in this kind of way. Let me give you another example. What happens when the commons are enclosed? And here I'm drawing on research and analysis by War on Want from about 15 years ago that occurred in several places in India when Coca-Cola was drawing deeply from the water table that is diminishing. So in the context of climate change, reduced water in the water table, a major multinational company starts setting up new plants and withdrawing deeper from the water flow. So of course, this reduces water availability for households. What happens when that commons gets enclosed by a powerful actor? Of course, it has immediate and direct impacts on households who depend upon that commons for their food and their health. It has gender impacts on women who must now walk much further to collect water from a well or a river. And it raises a question: how will the market respond in the face of this multinational player? How will the state respond? Will it protect the commons and people's ability to meet their essential rights and needs? Or will it actually be complicit with that very powerful player? We can all think of examples where this has gone both ways. What happens when the market captures essential resources? And of course, electric vehicles come into the story of climate change because so many people too quickly think that electric vehicles are a solution to reducing fossil fuels. But we know in Argentina, in Bolivia, in Chile, that the sudden turn to lithium mining and major mining companies coming in is having a huge impact and disruption in that market, big impacts on chemical pollution, on water, on land. That's impacting on families and communities in that area, on their health, on their water rights, on their land rights. Indigenous communities and rural communities finding that their commons are being enclosed, their land rights are being, they contest. So there's a real question here of what will happen in the state's response to protect the commons, or will they be indeed enclosed and captured? Who will have voice in resolving this issue? What happens when the state is incapacitated, such as by hurricanes in the Caribbean and in other small island developing states? When the state finds that through a hit like that, it literally has knocked out overnight the buildings, the transport and communications networks, energy supply, water, and any access to income, whether it's tourists visiting or indeed international travel. How does the state respond to such an incapacitation? Of course, it has very strong impacts across the whole economy, on households, on the market economy, on the commons. Very strong impacts around how can the resilience be built so that this doesn't knock out and have huge undermining impacts on people's well-being that goes on for years. How could, in fact, financing be designed to prevent or protect in that situation? What kind of finance would actually enable the state to protect and enable households to be resilient? Lastly, what happens when finance is frozen? From COVID lockdowns, I'm drawing an example from the Philippines, but of course this happened in countries all over the world. Finance has been frozen due to COVID not only being a health crisis, but an economic crisis, creating huge uncertainty in the global economy. So there's a financial and economic shock. This, of course, has direct impact on households and on the state's capacity to raise finance, impacting families, pushing them below that social foundation in the donut. And a question being, what can the state do, or where can other resourcing come from to make sure that households are not pushed into extreme impoverishment because of this shock? So let me pull back and say, just looking very quickly at these 5 different examples of what happens when actors are hit by that shock and the underlying vulnerabilities that have already been mentioned are exposed. How will different actors respond and be forced to react? What will be the knock-on effects? What happens when these risks compound and occur at the same time? And therefore, what can be done to understand and protect against this from happening? If you find this compelling and think you'd like to play with these concepts, then I really invite you to join us, because Pablo and I, in working on this tool together, said we'd love to host a webinar next February, open co-creation. So we warmly invite everybody here and beyond to join us online, how can we turn this into a really useful tool for this community to use? So if you want to join us, please do sign up at donuteconomics.org. Look at our events. This is 229. And maybe this time next year, we can come back to Understanding Risk 2023 and share with everybody what we've created. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate, for joining us. And again, for the audience, that was Kate Rayworth, who is an ecological economist and co-founder of Donut Economics Action Lab. We're very excited about the series of webinars that Kate and Pablo have come up with. And as she mentioned, please do follow that link and participate in that series of webinars next year. We're going to hand over now to Nicola Ranger, who is our final speaker, last but not the least, of course. And Nicola is head of sustainable finance research for development at the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group. She's also the senior researcher at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. And she'll be bringing things to a higher resolution in terms of some of the financial some of the potential financial solutions to compound and cascading risks. Over to you, Nicola.
Thank you very much, and it's an absolute honour to be here at Understanding Risk, and a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you all. So I'm going to talk about some very, very new research on the resilient donut, which I think flows quite well on from the last talk. I'm not going to juggle with this donut. I'm sorry about that. My juggling skills are not so good. But I wanted to illustrate this idea of what is a resilient donut. And the motivation of this is, until about 2 years ago, I was working in disaster risk management, on disaster risk financing, as we heard about earlier, had been working on that for several years. And then about 2 years ago, I moved into a different area of finance, of sustainable finance. And what really struck me is how different these two worlds are. So in disaster risk finance, we're looking at, and disaster risk management, how do we deal with crises now? Sustainable finance is all about, well, how do we ensure that we're financing, building risk into our financial system in a way that helps steer finance in ways that support long-term sustainability, so resilience over the very long term. And it was surprising to me that these two worlds were very, very separate. So recently I've started doing some work looking at, how do we bring these two worlds together? And working with a couple of excellent students of mine, one of them said to me, well, Nicola, it's all about getting in the donut. This is the solution. So to give you an example of what we mean by this, so we've been recently doing some work looking at the global food system. So I work a lot, as I said, on crises, and we've been looking a lot, based at Oxford, where I am, on how do we build a food system that is both resilient to crises now, so we don't see the types of shocks that we're seeing right now, but also that helps to build that resilience over the long term. And again, these tend to be two very, very different discussions. And what struck us is that, so in terms of building the long-term sustainability of these systems, it's very much, Kate's work has been very, very influential in this area. This idea of getting in the donut. So making sure that you're in this circle between the optimal between the societal needs and that planetary boundary. So for the food system, this is a whole range of measures, sustainable agricultural systems, for example. The fact that at the moment, around 90% of our calories comes from only 5 crops globally. And it comes from only about 5 what we call bread baskets globally. That is not a resilient system. That is not a sustainable system in the long term. So there's a number of things we need to be thinking about in terms of how do we build both sustainability and resilience. And the point, I think, how these two things come together is that what we're seeing is that if we're not sustainable, actually the area of this donut is getting smaller and smaller. So as we're moving towards our planetary boundaries, it's actually getting tighter and tighter and tighter and more difficult to stay in this boundary of sustainability. As we're eroding our biodiversity, for example, with climate change, with excessive use of resources, this is making this donut much, much more difficult to stay within. So that's a key challenge. But also it means that it's the chance of having these compounding, cascading risks that we're seeing is increasing substantially. So coming back to the example of the food system, there's research that looks at these global bread baskets and says, what's the chance that all these 5 global bread baskets will be affected at the same time? To give you an example, so at the moment, with the Ukraine crisis, 2 of our global bread baskets have been affected. And look at the devastation that's caused on many countries in terms of food security. But the probability of each of these 5 bread baskets being affected at the same time is about 1 in 100. Actually, over 20 years, a 1 in 100 year event can happen quite often. But actually with climate change, the really scary thing is that the probability of that happening is going to more than double every 5 years because of the increase in risk of droughts and flooding, for example. So that our ability to stay within this safe, sustainable sphere is being eroded by these longer-term drivers. So I'm going to talk about the role of finance in this, which is my particular focus. And I'm going to talk about 2 areas. So one, more the private finance, and then one on the public finance. So looking now beyond food systems more broadly. So in sustainable finance, we have there's a huge focus at the moment on net zero, as you'd expect. So making sure that financial institutions are stopping funding fossil fuels, for example, and moving into renewables, which is obviously a really key part of building that long-term sustainability and resilience. But there's a lot less focus on resilience as we would think about it. That doesn't tend to be part of the discussion. So a lot of my work is about trying to help financial institutions think about how can we encode risk and resilience into our financial decisions. To give you an example of why this is important, so if you think about global infrastructure investment, 2.7 trillion a year goes into building new infrastructure globally. Very little of that is thinking about climate or other types of resilience. So we're building in future risk at a massive, massive rate. Now that is about 60 times greater than all adaptation finance. That little box in the corner, that's adaptation finance versus infrastructure finance. So in terms of trying to stay within this donut and build resilience at the same time, we need to be getting risk and resilience into that 2.7 trillion a year of infrastructure investment. That's just one example. Another one, if you look closer to home at the FTSE 100 index companies, for example, in the UK, 45% of those companies, so that's 1.7 trillion in market capitalization, are in sectors that are potentially having a very significant impact on resilience all over the world. So these are big food companies, not necessarily thinking about societal resilience. These are big water-intensive companies. So again, encoding resilience into these financial flows is absolutely critical and is not happening at the moment. So if you'll see, for example, at COP27, all of the focus is on net zero, which is obviously incredibly important, but it's not tackling this big issue of the impact of finance on resilience. Now, coming into the public finance space, and some other work that we've been doing. So a key challenge we have, and this comes back to the point on building back better. So what we tend to see is we see progress on sustainability when there aren't big disasters. So when everything is happy, we can all think about how we invest in sustainability for the long term. But as we've seen in recent years, crises are happening more and more often. And what we see is that when crises happen, this shift towards long-term sustainability is stopped. So we have to deal with this crisis now. And you see a rhetoric of we need to build back better, but is that actually happening? So we looked at this, for example. This is what this figure here is showing. So we looked at all COVID-19 rescue and recovery expenditure. So this is in the trillions globally. And we looked at what that money was actually spent on. And we looked at whether that was actually building resilience, so we're actually building back better, or is it inhibiting resilience? And what we found, so the percentages here are the percentage of that spend, that trillions of spending, that is aligned with resilience, so things that should support the building of resilience, so investing in social care, investing in resilient infrastructure. So only about 3% of that financing was aligned with resilience. So we were not building back better. We were not learning the lessons. That's very clear. And what's even scarier is that actually potentially almost half of that were going into sectors that were not building resilience. So it was going into infrastructure, transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure that was not thinking about resilience. So we are going in the wrong direction. This is what we see when disasters happen. Actually, we stop, we deal with the disaster, which obviously we need to do, but as we come out of it, we're not learning these lessons. So we've been thinking about, well, how can we build a system? How can we take these lessons from the disaster risk management and start building them more into our thinking about how we deal with crises? So we get what we've been talking about as a sort of resilient transition. So we're transitioning towards sustainability as a society, but we're doing that in a way that acknowledges that shocks happen, and we can't let that transition stop every time a shock happens. So we've been thinking about, well, how do we do that? So what do we do at different phases of the disaster cycle? So part of that is, before the disaster happens, making sure that we're aligning our policy and finance with sustainability goals. But it's also about making sure we're preparing for when the shocks happen. So we're preparing our financial systems, and we heard earlier about disaster risk finance is a key part of that. So making sure we have these systems in place, shock responsive systems, automatic stabilizers, also creating fiscal space, because that's one of the key issues. Whenever a disaster happens, we eat away the fiscal space, we can't invest in sustainability. And then looking at sort of through the disaster cycle, how that needs to change through that. So my final point then, is one of the key things that has to underpin all this is obviously what we're talking about here, understanding risk. And that's a key challenge that we all know. And a key part of this that we see is that understanding risk, but the need also to build a common language of risk across communities. So we have the financial sector, we have governments, we have disaster management experts, etc., that are using different data, using different language about risk. And we feel that what we need is this common language, but also a common architecture of data, so everyone can access data. And I'm speaking to the converted here, hopefully, but the fact that we don't have this common data set of risk at the moment, and that information is inaccessible to different communities, I think is a key part of the problem. So we've been working with the UNDRR, number of partners around the world, including the World Bank and the private sector, to try to build this common understanding of risk. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've heard from our three panelists today about some of the root causes of risk, the potential solutions, the potential implications, but we do have a test for all of you just to check that you are listening. We're going to ask you to solve compound and cascading risks. Just by a clap of hands, who is prepared to give us some solutions from what you've heard today? Okay, it's going to be touch and go. I'm going to hand over to Pablo, who should be joining us now from online, who's going to lead us through what is going to be a very touch and go test of your knowledge on how to handle compound and cascading risks. I'm also going to invite some of our volunteers who you'll see joining us on either side of the auditorium, who are volunteers from the British Red Cross. This is serious. No, it's an interactive activity. Over to you online, Pablo.
Hello, friends. Hello again, and greetings from Brazil. Now in my capacity as Red Cross, Red Crescent. I am here at the UR base camp in Florianopolis. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Gratitude immensely to the tech team for juggling with so many surprises. There's so much compound risk when you see production teams making our magic happen. Thank you for illustrating how to manage compound risk. So I'm going to make you a little bit envious. You're in a beautiful venue. That London Design Museum is awesome. But look where I am. This is the venue in Florianopolis. And I'm not going to show you the ocean right there. If you hear sounds, it's either speakers or the ocean. But now we're going to make it even more complicated for you. If we could share the slide, dear team, we're going to have a general invitation, especially for our colleagues online, to go to a website, and Mark, if you want to copy paste in the chat, there's a QR code, or you can go to that short URL, qr.co.de/etc. And when you go there, you will be invited to view some cartoons that were created for this event, during this event. If we advance to the next slide, you will see one example of which you can encounter there. People take risks. We just had a wonderful acrobatics performance here in Florianopolis, and you had some spectacular things. If you see a cartoon that shows something that speaks to you about risk, what would you like to share with others? Go to the bottom where there's an invitation to type, write whatever you want. It will be anonymous, so be courageous, be gentle, be inviting, and then push submit, yellow button. You may need to scroll down and then advance to the next one, and there will be more. Now that is, everyone is welcome to do that. Friends online, get started. You'll have, I don't know, like 30 cartoons to view, and they're all drafts. They were made like literally half an hour ago, many of them based on the preceding session. But what we're going to do now is also offer those on site, both in London and in Brazil, to play, to experience compound risk in the flesh. If we advance to the next slide, those in London who were present in the previous session will know what is coming. First, we're going to have some objects that incarnate something metaphorical about risk. In your case, it may be some kind of ball. Here, of course, it's World Cup season, so it's an actual soccer ball. You are going to have to keep this in the air. Can we advance to the next one, please? Yes, so those of you who are in London, if we can go back to my PowerPoint slide, so we have the rules on the screen. Your job is to catch the ball, say one word or two about compound risk, and pass it to someone else. That person who catches it, I'm going to practice with my friend Jose. Jose has to catch, say one or two words, pass, etc. If the ball falls, it's a catastrophe. Everyone who notices has to say, "Oh no!" Are the rules clear? London, get started. People online, keep playing. I'll be back in 2 minutes with uncomplication. And Simfiwe, if you can, keep me posted to make sure that I understand what's going on site.
Sure, Pablo, we're going to get started here. So just to reiterate what Pablo said, and maybe Tilly and I can demonstrate, we have some risky stuff in the air on either side of the auditorium. So we're going to invite our British Red Cross volunteers to throw some risky stuff at you. You're going to catch it and give us one or two words about compound risk. So you might catch it and you might think hurricane, or you might catch it and you might think heat wave. You might catch it and think COVID-19. So what are the risky things that we have floating in the air? Catch it and keep it moving. Tilly? COVID-19. On your feet, you gotta catch it. Oh no! Let's try very gentle catches. Maybe make eye contact before you throw. Wonderful. Oh no! We have a lot of risky stuff falling all over the floor here in London, Pablo.
Can you hear me, friends in London? Because now we're going to add some complexity. I have here a donut. On a normal day, it may be a flotation device for kids to not drown. But now we're going to throw some donuts up in the air. And if you can, when you catch the donut, say something about how things change because of shocks. One word, two words. Hunger, injustice, enclosure. You do it. You have challenged your brain while risks keep compounding. You have about 2 minutes.
Oh no!
Well, my friends, I don't know if you can hear me, but what I can see is that the risks have been compounding to an almost unmanageable level. Now, going back to the donuts economic framing, each of us is, a child, a parent, a sibling, a peer in a household. Each of us offers or takes from others in the market. Each one of us has a relationship to a state, either by paying taxes or by voting or by receiving some help. Each of
Tornado.
us can and must relate to the commons just by breathing. So I wonder what thoughts came into your head as you see this cacophony of risky things, risky stuff coming and going, and how it relates to compound risk. I'm going to thank you all for enabling us to have this creative approach to interaction. And maybe we can offer a few moments to share on screen some of the cartoons, if you are hearing me. Over to
Okay, a quick clap of hands. Thank you so much for participating. So I'm going to invite our British Red Cross volunteers to please help us get rid of the risky stuff in the room. Thank you all so much for participating. I think part of the value add that the Red Cross Climate Center tries to pride itself in is in our ability to work with our teams across the world. Of course, a lot of us are split. We're a predominantly virtual team, especially at the Climate Center. But we try to keep online and in-person engagements fun, interesting, and interactive to the extent that they can be. And I think this particular activity is really helpful in thinking about, as you're navigating all of these balls coming at you, really embodying and having that visceral feeling of what it's like on the ground, at the policy or the research level, at the activist level, risk assessment, in the financial sector, thinking about what it looks like when multiple hazards, multiple risks are coming at you at once. And it really gets to the sense of or what underpins the work that we're doing right now with the Lloyd's Register Foundation, with the Anticipation Hub, with the World Bank, recently with Médecins Sans Frontières, about the ways in which compound and cascading risks come together to make impacts significantly greater than the sum of its parts. So we're no longer thinking about one tornado or one heat wave. We're thinking, as our panelists have mentioned, about multiple issues coming together to cause significant and far-reaching impacts, often beyond borders and beyond sectors. I do want us to have some time to receive questions from you, the audience. I suspect there might be interesting questions, given how dynamic the session has been. So I'm going to invite those with the microphones to please help field your questions. I think we have time for about 3 or 4 questions. And then we will lead very quickly into a final activity and reflection exercise. So shall we start with the first question from the audience here in London, please? By a show of hands, if you have a question for one of our panelists. I can't actually see. There's a guy over there. Can you wave? Wonderful. Can we get him a microphone, please, on the far right?
I'm holding one. That's okay.
Wonderful. Please go ahead and ask your question. Okay. Sorry, I can't see you.
No worries. Yeah, my name is Alan Leung from Macquarie Bank. So my question is for Dr. Ranger. You mentioned kind of embedding resilience in future sustainable finance. Do you have any kind of recent examples that you see that are out there that's innovative and you feel has a bit of traction and can be scalable?
Yeah. So we've sort of looked at 4 different parts of this. I should say this is an area that's kind of gradually ramping up, and we have seen some progress on in the last couple of months. But so there's 4 parts. So the first part is the normal managing those physical climate risks and other risks. But actually that's not enough, because if one bank, for example, is managing its own risks, that doesn't necessarily support the community around it, for example. So that's part 1. Part 2 is then making sure that when you're making decisions as a financial institution, what you're doing does not do significant harm to others. That sounds pretty obvious, but actually that doesn't happen in some circumstances. Then the next part is to look at, okay, are there opportunities, actually commercial opportunities for me as a financial institution in supporting the resilience of the communities around or through my clients? Because it is an opportunity, I think. It's not just a risk, and that's really important. And then the final part that we talk about is this alignment of thinking about, are the decisions that I'm making as a bank or as a pensions fund or as an insurer, are they supporting national adaptation goals, for example? Now, a good example of that, so that, you know, there's good examples on all four of those. There's some really great innovations on the opportunities side. So, for example, I work with a bank called BBVA, which is a big Spanish global bank. And they're doing some great work looking at sustainability-linked bonds, for example, to support their clients to invest in strengthening water or avoiding water resource issues. So they design a loan, so they basically get an interest rate reduction if they save water. So there's all sorts of little innovations like that we're seeing. On the infrastructure side, there's some great work that an organization called CCRI, who some of you might have heard about, is doing, looking at working with infrastructure investors and really supporting them through data and tools to bring risk into infrastructure decision making. So there's a lot of great work, but what I'm not seeing, I must admit, at the moment, is that really thinking outside of the box of, you know, how do we make sure the decisions we're making are actually supporting that long-term societal goal? And I think that's the next step.
So I had said we have time for 2 or 3 questions, but I've just been told we are running very, very hard on time. I want to propose one contingency and then invite you to do one additional activity. The contingency is that if you would like to ask questions directly to Drs. Nicola and Ksenia, who are here in person, I'd invite you to stay in the room and maybe come down and speak to them for a few minutes. And for those who are ready to leave, we have cards that we would like you to fill in. And on these cards, we would like you to write as legibly as possible some of the key takeaways that you've had from the full day, all of the sessions that you've participated in, especially those related to compound cascading risks. And when we meet again upstairs in about an hour, we're going to rank these and share them, a sort of working document, if you will. So we're going to pass out paper, pens. You're going to write down some of your reflections on these cards. Take them with you upstairs as you browse the museum. Reflect on what you've heard today. What's made sense? What hasn't? Do you have a sense of what compound and cascading risk is? Do you have an interest, a newfound interest or a newfound learning about the potentiality for solutions to compound and cascading risks, climate risks in the broader scope of things? And then bring these cards upstairs with you, please, to the top where we're going to read them in groups and exchange some of our reflections from the day. From the Red Cross Climate Center and also from the Anticipation Hub, and of course our partners who are the Lloyd's Register Foundation, as well as the World Bank, we really want to thank you for your attention and for participating in such a dynamic and quirky set of final sessions. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I hope that everyone has had a really fun day. Okay, so I've been asked to come and summarize, some of the key findings from the tree of risk that some of you might have the chance to take a look at. And for those of you who actually did have a chance to participate in this, so thank you so much for helping us with this activity, right? Okay, so this activity is really part of the Project Wavelength project, that I've been talking about. So essentially, we want to try to understand how the public and the experts might differ or deviate in terms of how they think about risk. Okay, so this activity is a little bit complicated, so please allow me just a couple of minutes to explain what exactly is going on, right? Okay, so essentially, you see this tree that actually has different types of risk related to health, right? And so you can see on the board, so on the screen here, so you have this tree. So there are different types of illnesses, different types of health conditions, but you also have different types of risk factors that could actually affect your health, right? So if you had come to the exhibit, you'll be asked the first question that you'll be asked is whether you have done any work in relation to healthcare. So if you have, then then we'll categorize you as an expert. If not, then you are just a member of the general public, right? Then you will be given two stickers, right? Two stickers, and you are asked to answer these two questions. So the first question is, which risk does the public not pay attention to? And the second question is, which risk does the government not pay enough attention to, right? So the question is, to what extent, are people thinking that there are particular types of health risk that might be what's called risk blind spots, right? That either the public or the government are not paying enough attention to, right? Okay, so I'd like to draw two general observations and conclusions from your participation. And before that, I just want to say that because of the very small sample size, as you can see, so we have to exercise caution in terms of, what we can actually learn from this. But suppose that, these trends were to hold up, with more data, there are really two things that we have learned, right? So the first thing is that for the public participants, right, participants who are actually members of the public, you actually see that most of them would choose like two items on these tree of risk. So the first is chronic anxiety, and the other is poor diet, right? So, so in general, people think that these are the two issues that either the public or the government have not been paying sufficient attention to, right? But interestingly, for people who actually have done work in the space of healthcare, you can see much more divergence, right? Much more diversity in terms of what they choose. Okay, we'll come to why this might be the case shortly. So the second observation is that, so every participant, as you recall, had to answer two questions, right? So what they think the public thinks and what they think the government thinks, right? So we also found that among members of the public, right? So you actually see that there is much more internal consistency, right? So you see, if people were to select an item for question 1, they are also more likely to select that item for question 2, right? So this means that, these participants perceive that these areas in general have not received enough attention, whether by the public or by the government. But again, among the experts who participated in this exhibit, you see much more divergence, right? So if a particular expert thinks that, this issue has not received enough attention for the public, it does not mean that he or she would think that this is an issue that has not received enough attention from the government, right? So it's interesting. So I think you can see, lots of, you can see that among members of the public, there is actually much more evidence of internal consistency, right, in terms of what they choose, but also external consistency, right? So interpersonal as well as intrapersonal, right? So what have we learned from this? So I would like to just conclude with three general thoughts that I would like to leave with you, and perhaps these are some of the questions that you might want to continue to think about, right? So the first is that suppose, for a particular member of the public, right, if I think that the public is not paying enough attention to this issue, what is actually the perception of my own, the degree of attention that I am actually attaching to this issue, right? Does it mean that because I actually have not been paying attention to this, so I anchor my response in predicting how the public would think? Or could it be that I'm paying a lot of attention to something, so I think that the rest of the public are not paying enough attention to that particular risk, right? So that's question, point number one. Question number two is that, right, so what are some of the drivers for this divergence that we see between the public and the experts, right? So could it be that experts, for example, they have much more information, they are specializing in particular types of risk, so they might be more focused on those specific domains or issues, whereas the public, might be getting information from the media, from external sources, so they're actually much more convergence in how they think, right? The third is that what can we do about it, right? So as practitioners, as experts, what can we do to actually bridge the gap in risk understanding or risk perception between the public and experts, and also as individuals, what can we do to actually better protect ourselves from some of this risk? So I'd like to leave all of you with these three questions, and with that, thank you so much for your participation, and enjoy the rest of the day. Yeah.
So what I'm going to do is ask Leonard to lead the cry of hello from London.
Oh, okay.
And we just want perhaps standing up in big arms, just something really visual for our friends in Brazil.
Oh, okay.
And I think our things are ready. So you just, if you could count people in and you could give a big hello from London.
Hello from London.
Like this. Okay, so let's go. 1, 2, 3. Hello from London! Thank you very much. One more.
One more.
1, 2, 3. Hello! So, see you all upstairs in the Huth Gallery at 4:45.